Okay, now let's talk about how to know God's truth via an intellectual analysis of law. So what do we mean by intellectual analysis of law? That's quite a...
Yes, well, perhaps we could look at in a family situation where parents decide that they're going to bring up a family, so they have a couple of children, and they decide they're going to make specific rules or laws by which the family will live. Now, if we intellectually analyse these rules or laws, we can start to assume a lot of things, or start to postulate a lot of things about the condition or the ideals and the character and the nature of the people involved. So, for example, if a parent makes a law, you can't go out and play on the street. You know, that's a big rule that a lot of parents would make, particularly in the Western world. In the third world, not made at all, hardly.
That's the only place to play.
Yeah, exactly. But in the Western world, frequently it's one of the laws or rules that are made by the family. We can start to make assumptions about, well, obviously they care for their children's life. Otherwise they wouldn't be worried about their children, having an accident. But how much of this care is driven by their own fear and not, and how much of this care of the children's life is actually helping educate the child? It's hard to determine that. But there are certain things that it does help us determine. They obviously care for the child.
They want the child's life to continue.
Yeah. So that's a very good thing. And, they obviously have some reasons why they made the law. But we don't necessarily know what those reasons are, of course. Some of them might be what we would classify as moral and good or ethical, and some of those reasons might not be very good at all. It might be a lot to do with control or manipulation and other kinds of things like that. So, but we can't really know that. All we can know or do is intellectually analyse and postulate possible reasons why a family has created the law they've created. Now, the same kind of analysis, we could say, applies to God's laws. So we could say, okay, God created the law of gravity. Let's analyse what gravity does. Obviously, it protects us to a degree. It helps us stay on the planet. It means that all of our food stays on the planet and all the air we breathe stays on the planet, and so forth and so forth. All of these things help us to survive. So obviously, whoever created this law must have wanted us to survive for as long as possible. Otherwise, why not just give birth and fly out into space and you have an existence of a few seconds and that's the end? Obviously, this person wanted our life to be sustainable for long periods of time in the physical. Otherwise, the law of gravity would never have been created, right? So we can start to postulate possible concepts about the personality and nature and character of the individual who potentially created these laws, assuming that there is such an individual existing, of course.
Yes, that's the basic assumption that we make there.
Yes.
And we talk about how to establish if God exists in another whole discussion.
Of course, and there are many methods of establishing God's existence, and that is one of them, actually. The existence of intelligent laws that support our life is actually one part of the evidence supporting God's existence. But, of course, there are many others. But even assuming all of that is not true, we could say, well, the fact that the law exists and the fact that it's working in our benefit is interesting in itself, isn't it? You would think if it was just all come about by chance that some of the laws will work in our benefit, some won't. But the reality is all laws seem to work in our benefit. So particularly when it comes to the law of gravity, it seems to work in our benefit completely. So isn't this fantastic? Isn't that wonderful? How did that come about? That helps us to start thinking about those kind of subjects too.
So knowing God's truth through intellectual analysis of God's laws seems like it's got some benefits.
Yes.
What would be the drawbacks of that method of trying to establish God's truth?
The drawbacks are related a lot to our personal emotional condition. In other words, we often feel that because we feel a certain way, it means somebody else feels that way. So to give an example, one of God's laws, when it's broken, creates cancer.
Yeah.
Many times because of our personal emotional injuries, we believe we're getting punished by God. by having cancer. Or we believe that God's taking us or putting us through some tribulation or putting us through some nightmare event for some future benefit that we can't see. We come up with all of these concepts and ideas, all of which, by the way, are false, all the ones I've mentioned anyway. But we come up with those concepts and ideas because of our emotional belief systems. So frequently what we do is we analyze God's laws, and then what we do is we distort the character of the individual based on our own personal character distortions. So obviously that's not very helpful in finding out the truth.
No, and to me it seems like a very big drawback in that there's a lot of ways I can go wrong through the analysis of just law alone to help me learn God's truth and who is God. Yeah. It's really interesting how this analysis can be distorted so much by our emotional condition. And when you examine the relationship between our emotional condition and what we believe based on certain events, sometimes if you look at it logically, you go, how did you arrive at that conclusion given that circumstance? Because there's 2,500 other conclusions you could have arrived at that are all just as valid as the one that you arrived at. Why did you arrive at the one you arrived at? And frequently it's because of the underlying emotional distortions that already exist within us, caused by our parental upbringing and so forth, that cause these particular distortions and therefore cause a distortion in our ability to be logical. Yeah. All right, so let's move on to hopefully some more reliable ways of learning